Welcome to GoodGame, your no BS insights for crypto founders.
Our kind of like a goal is to think about, even on this was the goal on V2 that is coming out now, but also in the future, how we can actually make less decisions, build less, and give more decisions to these applications and social media founders and just support whatever they're trying to enable, including improving and enabling monetization for them. So I think that's the right direction for us to go. And I think I've been very surprised the level of some of these applications, because Lens has been in a mainnet roughly a bit over a year. And many of these founders, they built from scratch applications that have a user experience that doesn't kind of like, you don't see the blockchain in the transactioning when you're using Lens, which is quite amazing. And it's still kind of like the floor, and there's no ceiling on the experience that you could actually build. And I think we're just in the beginning phase of that.
Looking for your next startup idea in crypto? Check out our request for startups list and get inspired at alliance.xyz/ideas. Welcome to GoodGame. Today, we're going to have Stani on from Lens and AAVE. And it's interesting that we're bringing on both Stani this week and Dan Romero a couple of weeks ago in regards to Farcaster. It seems really like the, I don't know if you want to call it the fall or the next era of crypto is going to be social, decentralized social. Do you feel like that's true? Like, I mean, it's very similar to DeFi summer, right? When some of the early protocols started to gain traction, right? Like Synthetics and ETH-Lend at the time, Compound with Compound, like token farming launch. I feel like my mental model is similar. Like I'm comparing it to DeFi summer. Do you feel like that's true?
I think that's cope, Imran.
Sir.
All right, but
look, I need number to go up. It's been going down.
Okay.
Cue the guy about, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so sorry. Okay.
No. It's probably cope, but I hope it's not.
I hope it is DeFi summer. So my heart says it's DeFi summer, but my brain says it's not. And I'll tell you why. Decentralized social is extremely interesting, no doubt about it. But there's some really key differences between decentralized social and DeFi. And number one, it's really underappreciated. But do you remember when DeFi summer happened? It was right after COVID, right after Jerome turned on the printer. And not just Jerome, it's Jerome and Biden at the same time. It's both the monetary and the fiscal policies. And there was money being airdropped into people's bank accounts directly. People had the money to gamble on things like DeFi. DeFi back then was a total. It was a good casino. I mean, it still is, but it was a casino. That's the number one key difference. Right now, there's no Jerome, there is no Biden, and we're actually maybe half a year too early compared to, like, if we assume that we're still in this 4-year cycle, right? We're actually half a year ahead of DeFi summer when it comes to timeline. So that's the number one key difference. Number two, and this is what I really hope to see with decentralized social, was that DeFi, one of the most magical things about DeFi summer was the composability. It's all these different protocols composing with each other that created all these random fruits, yam and pickles, all these things being traded on Uniswap and lending and staking and farming, all that stuff. The composability was the key aspect of DeFi summer. What I really want to see with decentralized social, which we haven't seen yet, for example, on Friend.tech, I want to see more composability between Friend.tech and others, or between Lens and others, or between Farcaster and others. I really hope to see that, because if that happens, decentralized social is going to be DeFi summer.
It's a big unlock. Yeah,
that is the big unlock. And currently, decentralized social isn't, or let's just take one at a time, like Friend.tech, let's say, or whatever, or Farcaster or Lens. It's not as playable as DeFi summer yet, and the playability comes from the composability, if that makes sense. So I really want to see more of that. So anyway, those are the two key differences.
So I'm going to argue both. Okay. The first is, I agree. Liquidity was much more abundant during the early 2020s. In fact, that's when Alliance launched, right? Officially. I mean, we were around since 2019, but we launched, our first cohort launched in March of 2020.
Right. Yeah.
But you could argue that, we've, and maybe I mean, from a macro perspective, I don't know if there's any more cuts, right? I feel like we're pretty close to the end. There could be a world where Q1 of 2024, we may see a reduction in rates, right? That could start to inject more liquidity back into riskier assets. So, I mean, that is a plausible play. Not saying it isn't.
Mm-hmm.
So, and when you say 6 months, you're probably right. You have like the next 3 to 6 months. It's really about how the macro is going to change and evolve. But then also, like, all of these projects starting around the same time gives me the inclination that something is happening here, right? Versus if you look at all the sectors in crypto, the most exciting sector as of right now is social.
100%.
And we could talk about Lens with Stani, and we talk a bit about all the cool stuff that's coming out with Lens, Farcaster, and others. And then 2 is composability. And I think we're going to leave this for our Friend.tech conversation, which we're going to record next week. But there's a lot of new things that are happening on Friend.tech that's pretty cool. And so every day I'm seeing at least 2 to 5 projects launching around the Friend.tech ecosystem. And I don't know, like, if we're getting ahead of ourselves, like we typically do, but you see things like lending, which I don't know how I feel about, right? But you're seeing bots, you're seeing infrastructure being built, like something called Friendbook, where you get to see all the feeds aggregated. There's a lot of cool things that are happening on the Friend.tech ecosystem, but it might be too early.
What I do agree with you is that social is the single most important or the single most interesting area that's happening in crypto right now. And partly it might be because there's no more money left. Like, all the speculative stuff is not happening anymore. Like, DeFi is not really happening. NFTs are dead, blah, 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 blah. And then at the same time, Farcaster went to all-time high when it comes to users. Lens is launching their version 2.0. And then Friend.tech is, basically captured the imagination of everyone on Twitter. So 100%. Social is, I mean, we spent 2 episodes talking about social precisely for this reason. And there's going to be a third.
Yeah, and this is like the final installment, let's say, of our social series, because we're giving this a lot more thought, because at least we think this is the most interesting sector as of now, and it could lead us to the next wave in the bull market. And so with Lens and Stani specifically, I'd love to learn more about what is Lens? Like, why is it everything is completely on chain, whether it's profiles, whether it's follows, comments, everything is on chain compared to, let's say, Friend.tech or even Farcaster, right? So Farcaster, they run their own nodes, right, called hubs, and the hubs will aggregate all of these messages and store them on its own, like, server, right? Whether it's through a blockchain or through its own server, etc. So they have some way of, like, scaling, while all of the storage and everything here happens on, like, a data availability layer, right? Like, I forgot what it's called, Momoka. Momoka. And so it's very interesting trade-offs in the way, Stani and Lens team has thought about, like, storing and being able to create, like, on-chain identities versus Farcaster and even Friend.tech for that matter.
Yep, absolutely. Also, we haven't seen him in 2 years, so great opportunity to just catch up and see where things are going. Not just Lens, but also AAVE, right?
Yeah, so maybe talking a bit about AAVE, like, I'd love to learn more about the current DeFi ecosystem and RWAs, because it seems like RWAs is a major narrative in DeFi. And in fact, there's a lot of public figures are staking their reputation on why RWAs are going to be the next big thing.
Leschner, for example.
Leschner, Scott Lewis with Contos.
Yep.
And a couple others are betting big on, or even Rune at
that's right. Yeah, 100%.
Maker.
Yep.
Right. And so it'll be interesting to see how the RWA narrative plays out.
And also synthetics, by definition, is RWA. So basically all the DeFi gods are in RWA now.
So it seems like RWAs could be the next meta. We don't know, but we shall see. And then finally, him being a founder, and, like, what founders in crypto should be thinking about and how they should be building the space and lessons learned. I think that could be also an important element. Cool. Well, I think we should bring Stani on.
do it.
Welcome to Good Game. Today we have Stani, the founder of AAVE and Lens, on to discuss both where social fi is going to go, or crypto social, and then more importantly also DeFi and what's happening with AAVE and Go. And finally, we'll probably touch a bit about his founder's experience. Right, I think you're one of the first founders, Stani, in crypto to have started two companies in two different sectors. And I think there are a lot of founders that are out there that are aspiring to do the same. So I think lessons learned could be a really good element to just kind of give our founders an idea of what it takes to get to the level you're at.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here. So it's been quite a journey over the years. I'm happy to share my experience and also what I'm working on today, both on Aave and on the Lens side.
Awesome. Qiao, any comments, questions before we get started?
No, I'm just really excited how to. I haven't seen you in like 2 years, so just want to see where things are. So.
It's been a while.
Yeah, it's been a while.
Awesome. So maybe I think for us, I'd love to dive deep into Lens first, just because there's just a lot happening. Obviously, there's a lot happening on Aave too, but with the most recent update on V2 and potentially a DevNet launch very soon coming up, I'd love to kind of talk about the architecture of Lens protocol first, and how is it different from there are a few other crypto social apps today like Farcaster, Friend.tech sort of, and so maybe talking about what is Lens, and then maybe we could dive deeper into the architecture of Lens.
Yeah, I mean, to put it in a simple way, Lens is a set of social networking primitives that you can use when you're building social media applications. So for example, Lens, what a primitive, for example, is that it's a feature or an idea that you can build different kinds of use cases. And social networking has different kinds of like online primitives these days. For example, creating a profile, following other profiles, pretty much things that we do ongoing basis, creating publications. And then you have more Web3 native primitive, such as, for example, collecting content, whether it's music, art, or something, textual content. So the protocol itself means that it has a multiple of these primitives. So you can create a handle, your identity, you can create a profile, which is your follow graph, and both of those elements are secured by the blockchain. So we're using on-chain in a way of securing ownership for the users. What it doesn't mean is that developers trade ownership in their applications against revenue, for example, giving out handles, giving out the profile ownerships, or some other ownership like content ownership. And it's a very new idea in the past couple of years, because we're used to make all of our social connections over an internet where there is no ownership. So it's basically a land that is rented out. So we're building these experiences and networks, our own personal networks, on a kind of like rented out land. And what it means is that currently, in most cases, users' profiles, their handles, their follow graph, the connections they're making are within the application. So what Lens enables is that you can actually start bringing that ownership to the user and even add portability. So if you own your identity and your follower graph, you can go from one application to another and just log in with Lens and you see your followers. So instead of being a number in a database, they're actually secured on the blockchain. So these are kind of like basic primitives that the Lens protocol offers amongst others. And obviously our goal is to help developers to build their social media applications, because Lens, our team, we don't have an application. We're basically servicing these developers to build their own and empowering them with on-chain technology.
Before we dive deep into the architecture, I want to call out something which is very interesting, which is, and I think Qiao will find this amusing as well. For the most part, most protocols that launch will always have some sort of like client-side app, right?
Yeah.
That will enable, to showcase both to the community and the people that, this is a type of product that should be built, And this is where the team resources are being put behind it. An example of this is like, let's say Farcaster recently, right? Like they focus on having a client first app. For Lens, when you guys first launched, you didn't even have a client app, right?
Yeah, exactly. So in the beginning, we were trying to also figure out our vision. So what we want to do. So originally, we wanted to actually maybe even build an experience. So we wanted to show examples of how you actually could build a social media application where all the blockchain logic happens in the background and is abstracted away from the users. But this is already something that's done by many of the social media applications that are integrating Lens. So you don't sign for transactions, you don't pay gas. All of that is abstracted away from the users. So in some ways, we wanted to first deploy the protocol and see what people will build and whether we see any applications. And it actually happened that we saw some applications being built. So there's, for example, Orb, that is a mobile first application, Favor, Butterfly, and a couple of more open source ones like Lenser and LensTube that are just community applications that can be forked by anyone if they want to create their own experience. And this is very exciting because when you're building from solely a protocol perspective, it really puts you into a position where you have to listen to the developers and create a feedback loop where you're trying to understand what's valuable for these social media founders and their teams to build social media applications that have Web3 features. And what are those things actually that are useful? So, for example, in most cases, you don't really need to integrate the whole Lens protocol. Maybe you just want handles or profiles, or you just want to integrate a collect button into your blog as a social media primitive, or whatever that might be from the stack. And I think that flexibility is very valuable. So the way I usually think about the whole protocol versus application approach is that a protocol is truly a protocol when it's basically has it is a primitive, meaning that it doesn't really limit developers to build a use case that they're interested in using that primitive. If the protocol has enough rules and it's becoming opinionated, then it really isn't a protocol. It's something else. It's basically a smart contract based system supporting your own application use case, and that's the biggest difference. And I think when we think about the protocols and applications, an application influences a protocol, and a protocol influences an application, and that's why it's hard to build a protocol that is very open, unopinionated, and serves different kinds of use cases. And that's why I think that being able to ship the protocol only and not first, but just protocol only, it gave us actually perspective what these Web3 social builders actually need and what kind of use cases they could actually need some of these primitives. And that has been quite, I would say, eye-revealing experience.
So just to touch on the point that both of you brought up, to me, the biggest difference that I've seen as a user between Lens and others, including Farcaster, is to me, Lens feels a lot more like a bottom-up crypto native project. You launch the protocol and you get a number of clients being built on top. Whereas Farcaster, they're more top-down, building, focusing on the application. So Dan Romero actually calls it like application-driven protocol development. By the way, I've used like a dozen of applications on Lens. They're all very different. There's like a YouTube on Lens. There's like Instagram, and there's like many other different behaviors or experiences on Lens, but based on the same social graph, based on the same profiles. And that to me is the biggest difference I've seen.
I do think that, let's say that if we will build an application, that application will drive quite a lot on what the protocol should be. And I think that's a kind of like a hard part to achieve, because a protocol should be the minimum set of rules that actually serves any use case on that particular category. Like if you look, for example, today, many of these DeFi protocols out there, they seem more like kind of like on-chain systems, like end-to-end systems with a decentralized governance on top than purely like a protocol to network and message data and kind of like serve different kinds of use cases. And also, like if it's too limited, it means that a lot of the use cases will look quite the same. So even if the experience is like our kind of like a goal is to think about, even on this was the goal on V2 that is coming out now, but also in the future, how we can actually make less decisions, build less, and give more decisions to these applications and social media founders, and just support whatever they're trying to enable, including improving and enabling monetization for them. So I think that's the right direction for us to go. And I think I've been very surprised the level of some of these applications, because Lens has been in a mainnet roughly a bit over a year, and many of these founders, they built from scratch applications that have a user experience that doesn't kind of like, you don't see the blockchain in the transactioning when you're using Lens, which is quite amazing. And it's still kind of like the floor, and there's no ceiling on the experience that you could actually build. And I think we're just in the beginning phase of that.
Playing devil's advocate, and I'll give you an example of 0x Protocol back in 2017. If you remember 0x Protocol, Stani, I'm sure you do. When they first launched, they launched as a protocol, and they wanted AMMs and DEXs to be built on top. And 0x Protocol was supposed to be the liquidity layer to enable seamless liquidity between all the AMMs that are being, or DEXs being built on 0x Protocol. But it turns out that it was a very hard problem to solve, because getting DEXs to be built on 0x Protocol was actually very hard. We had, I remember like 20, 30 startups that built around that ecosystem, and ultimately they all kind of fizzled out, because it's very hard to bootstrap, a very strong, getting liquidity on the protocol, and then getting all the startups building around that ecosystem. And then so they ended up focusing on Matcha, right? So then they launched Matcha, built like a first party product, and then they were able to bring on more and more people using the 0x Protocol. So I'm curious on like how you thought about that, and then what you're building now, and why you think this approach is going to work.
It's really interesting perspective, because in some ways, kind of like sometimes it depends what we think about liquidity in kind of like a social media context. So, and depending obviously on the primitive. So for some social media applications, it might be the content itself. So the content liquidity, or the networking liquidity, that people are connecting to each other and making connections. And I think you kind of like have that shared liquidity when you plug in Lens. So if you're building something new, or you're building simply a game, let's say we've seen few games like this, kind of like a Flappy Bird type of a games built on Lens. There's a couple of teams focusing on just building games and integrating Lens, for the idea of that you could like, you have this user base that you can tap into. So if you allow to sign with Lens and allow the Lens users to come and play, you already have this kind of like a network liquidity in the sense of of the users. Maybe you're building a publication, sort of like a content application that focuses on content. For example, what Twitter is today, or Instagram with a new experience. Then you might want to tap into the kind of like a shared social graph, but in that content there. But in some cases, you might just want to start from scratch, and you just want the tools to build out your own liquidity, and you have your own recipe, what you need, but you want to have those Web3 primitives, and you want to have monetization. So I do think it works both ways. I do think the challenge with that case is that these primitives, they actually need to work. So, and the more new primitives we have, we can actually test them out, what works and what doesn't work. And those that doesn't, they necessarily don't need to exist, for example. But it might be that there's one particular primitive that works for everyone. And as long as there's a healthy feedback and monetization loops between a protocol and the developers all the way to their end users, there's more chances to work. And I think the 0x example, I think also the challenge there is that, where do you start when you want to build, let's say, a decentralized exchange what do you need to make it actually successful? So here's the problem that we're talking about. The protocol, if it's too limited and if it limits to what you can actually build, that's going to be the main challenge, because it's not a protocol, then it's something else. But if it's just a simple primitive that you can utilize, maybe that's liquidity at a certain price or just simple routing, it's easier to build on that. And as I mentioned before, most of the DeFi protocols, they are not really primitives. They're just on-chain systems that then many of these projects, they basically invite developers to build on top of that system. But it's not a kind of like a something where you can take from the shelf an exact primitive that helps you to build something new and is non-restrictive. I think that's where the kind of like difference becomes, because it's very easy that a lot of these teams, they label their on-chain systems as protocols, but factually they're just products on-chain.
This is a good segue into Lens V2, because I'm sure you've learned a ton from working with developers on V1, which has been around for a couple of years now. What are some of the new primitives you're thinking about? Because I've seen your announcement, and there seems to be quite a few new primitives on V2, and maybe the architecture is completely different too. So maybe talk about your vision and what V2 looks like.
Yeah, I think when we started to build Lens V1, our idea was to build a modularized protocol. So you have different components that you could actually use or customize. So for example, there's a specific module that you can actually use, like a follow module. So it's really simple. It's just processes transactions of connecting profiles to each other, right? Then there's another module that is pay to follow. So to follow someone, you need to pay a transaction on that, and that goes to the person the profile you're following. So it's kind of like a custom. You have a lot of customization there, but it still feels that what we build is kind of you can go even further on opening up the protocol and all these primitives that are there for social networking. And what we were thinking is that we wanted to build something that is less and less opinionated and as open as possible. And with Lens V2, we changed even some of the components and primitives. For example, in version 1, the profiles and the handles are attached together in one profile NFT. So we realized that actually we have two different primitives there. So there are users that care about their identity and their handle, so they might want to use their own handles there. Such as, for example, ENS. Or they want to use the Lens specific handle, or you might have a developer that says, well, I want my own handles. How can I actually do this through Lens? So you have this different kind of like scenarios. And then you have a profile NFT. So a profile NFT is simple a way to register your follow graph, the connections you make and the audience that you create across Lens. Separating these two creates the ability to actually change your handle. And if you create even a brand from your like follow graph, you can also transfer that to somewhere else. So that's kind of like changes that we've done in the architecture. And also we figured out that we have different actions on, for example, on publications that are typical social networking actions. Commenting, mirroring, which is same as reposting, collects also as a Web3 native action. But what we were thinking is that what if we actually open up the whole system and let anyone to create any kind of an action directly on the publication? So what this means is that you could actually create a publication, content on Lens, and you can attach any action that is some sort of on-chain transaction. And we call this open action. So a good example is that, just a simple example, is that you are super excited that the price of ETH is going up, and you create an action where people can buy ETH on that publication, or you have an NFT, like let's say you have Sandbox land that you want to sell. You can create a publication content and you can post it. And the action there is to buy specific land in your neighborhood in Sandbox. Anything that is available on chain, even cross chain with an Oracle, you can create a action. And the idea here is that we extend the composability on Lens to anything that exists. and at the same time, let all these protocols and everything that is created on chain use the Lens user base as a distribution channel. So effectively, all these actions that we're doing across the Web3, you could, in theory, do directly on your Lens feed. And I think that's really, really cool.
Okay, so let me summarize my understanding. So on Lens V1, Lens V1 was very opinionated. So for example, the collect action. So the collect action, what it is, for those who don't know, is it turns a post into an NFT, and then the user can own that NFT, right? Which
yes,
represents
exactly.
It's a very specific type of action. Your vision for V2 is, instead of being so opinionated about what actions you provide to the developers, you just give them a generic layer upon which they can create generic actions, like any actions that they want. So for example, the user sees a post about ETH, and then they can just buy ETH within the post itself. Or the user posts about an NFT and then buys the NFT, or potentially even with AAVE, I don't know, like you can directly borrow land,
deposit to AAVE, or vote in AAVE governance, which is
exactly
really cool.
So anything you can do on chain today can become a action on Lens. That
exactly.
is my understanding.
Exactly. And that's really exciting because we all spend most of our, like, I wouldn't say most of our time, but like a lot of our time on social media. So we're scrolling these feeds, and that's actually where we give a lot of attention. And that's a place where you can actually have those interactions. Can be like donating to Gitcoin grants or whatever that action actually is. It kind of reminds a bit the idea of Uniswap hooks. So you just open up the surface to others to build those different kind of hooks into the existing architecture. And that's related to the publications, and being unopinionated is really hard because we all kind of like walk with some sort of opinions and how social media works. Because when I go to different people in our space and I ask how you would want to see Web3 social or like decentralized social to be built, and can you give me examples of different features, they usually refer to Twitter, right? So like that's where a lot of the crypto activity is happening, or Reddit. But social is actually bigger than that. There are obviously big social media applications, TikTok and Instagram and whatnot. But there's a lot of social media applications that are just messaging applications or just games. So the actual imagination of how to build social is far more bigger than what we're thinking as Web3 builders today. And becoming less opinionated and talking to different people helps us to kind of like take just more steps back and ensure that we're delivering primitives that really help those different use cases. And that really strengthens the idea of a protocol because it can serve across various use cases because it's simple enough and unopinionated enough primitive to be used across these different applications.
A question related to architecture. I remember on Lens V1, virtually everything is on chain, not just the profiles, but also the messages. And if I recall correctly, they were on Polygon. On V2, does this change? I remember there was something about RWAs. But I'm just curious, where's the information stored? Which chain is it stored?
So the whole Lens stack is a combination of on-chain primitives and also data availability, I would say also primitives. And then obviously you can choose what you want to use off-chain because, again, it goes back to the idea that the primitives you want to use should specifically fit your use case. So if you just want people to be able to collect, you should be able to add a collect button without adding profiles, whatever that might be. So we noticed that there was a lot of activity on Lens, and we noticed that a lot of the activity was around tokenizing the content and making on-chain transactions. And we realized that actually not all of the content really needs to be on-chain. So we broke down the system a bit, and we were thinking that when users will really benefit from on-chain transaction, when they only need one component of a blockchain like data availability, and when they actually need a off-chain transaction. So what we created is that an architecture where you can transact on-chain and you can create tokenized content if you want to, and you have that intent, and maybe you have monetization or some sort of on-chain execution that you want to add there. And that's fine, you can do that. But we noticed that in many cases, the users really just wanted data availability. And just give an example what it means and how it works. So when you do a transaction across apps that are integrated Lens, when you create content, instead of creating on-chain content, what happens is that data availability content is created instead with this tool we created, which is called Momoka. It's a data scaling tool. So which means that blockchains are producing blocks, and there's a limited amount of capacity there, how much you can actually get data in, even if you're on a low cost chain. But social media data is a data stream, so you can't fit everything into a single block. You need to wait for the next one, whatever that block time is. But regarding data availability, it's just upload and download. So you have a data streaming model where you can scale on high use cases. And just to give an example, Twitter has 25,000 transactions per second at a peak time, like the World Cup of football. So what you can do with the data availability transactions is that you can create content, so you can create internet artifacts that exist, and you don't have the fear that they basically disappear. So there's a component of ownership. And the use case there is, for example, that we might create content that is valuable and we want to actually be preserved, but we don't want to have the risk that it's not actually available. So for example, if Medium disappears tomorrow as a business, what happens to all those content that is created over the internet? So all those artifacts and everything we create. So there's a risk of that. But the main point there is that if that content becomes very interesting, you can always mint it later on chain if it's for some reason like culturally relevant or there's demand. So basically we have this ladder system. So if it's important to be on chain and you want to have monetization, create an on-chain transaction. If you want only to preserve the content and ensure that if your application goes down, you want the users to still own the content, do the Momoka transactions. If you want to do, let's say, private transactions like DMs, use a database or shared database with some encryption. So it's just creating more choices for the engineers.
Can you just very quickly, Momoko is it based on an existing data availability layer, or is it its own DA layer?
So basically, it's a tool where you can actually plug in any data availability layer we have. So you can use RWAs, IPFS.
Right.
What Momoka does, it basically has verification. So it simulates the transactions as if they would go into the blockchain by using a node. And that transaction is simulated so your transaction is compatible by whatever blockchain rules you're passing. And then what you do, you take the transaction, and instead of putting into the blockchain, you put into the data availability layer through Momoka. And then if later you want to mint it on chain, you basically take that transaction with all the data and mint it on chain, and you still have the same data set. And then you have so you have the concept of submitters and provers. So submitters are the ones that submit these transactions. And then you have provers to actually then run a prover script to verify that this verification was done exactly how it's supposed to be done. And obviously you can choose yourself where you want to dump the actual data, which is any data availability layer that is supported. Mainly it's RWAs today.
So let me just quickly summarize my understanding. It's a tiered approach, and the tiers are based on how much the users want in terms of security and ownership. The bottom of the layer is
exactly.
It's a private database. Like the user and the developer can choose to store some information in a private database. That's the bottom of the layer. And the second layer is if you want a little bit more security and user ownership, you can use a DA layer like RWAV or IPFS or whatever. And then at the top of the layer is if the user wants something highly secure, highly owned by the user themselves, they can choose like on-chain, like Polygon or whatever. And that's the idea.
Exactly. Basically, like if you have 100,000 followers or like million followers, maybe you want to own them forever. That's the beauty of Lens. Maybe if you have handle basically Imran or Qiao, like a short handle, maybe you want to own it and ensure that no one can take it away from you. And then eventually what it means is that these developers, they're actually giving the application properties, the real estate to the users in exchange of revenue. So it's basically a monetization model for developers in the future to tap into. So imagine today if you could actually own your Reddit handle and sell it later, or that audience as well. It's definitely good real estate to own and exchange.
I was reading through the developer docs a few days back, and the design of the entire Lens protocol is quite novel. As Qiao alluded to earlier, everything is primarily on chain, right? While you have maybe Farcaster, which is in the middle, and then to the right, which is probably Friend.tech, which is like the most centralized, as the way we see it. And a few things I want to just re-highlight is everything there's 3 layers of tokenization, right? And it's all done through an ERC 721 standard. So follow, there's profiles, and there's collect, right? Those are the 3?
Yeah, basically three different tokenization primitives. Yeah.
Got it. And so V2 then builds on top of that, which is being able to, one, have the open actions, right? So you're able to embed essentially smart contract integration directly into Lens. So if I scroll and I see someone that's shilling an NFT that I want to mint, I can mint directly within the app. And the really cool thing about this is there's a whole value capture layer that V2 also introduces, which I want to talk about next, which is the ability to monetize action all the way down to the algorithm, right? So an example of that I want to give is, let's say I sell, or let's say I'm minting an NFT and I put it on Lens. The person that mints it could get some sort of reward of the fee. The person that shares it or does a mirror of that transaction could also get some value out of that creator fee. The algorithm, the Lens app, client app also, right? So there's like, maybe explain what the value capture chain looks like within Lens, right? And how a person could monetize. I'm just trying to get a better understanding of what this could enable.
Yeah, no, this is that's really good actually explanation of that. And simply, like, blockchain somehow is like by default a monetization layer. I mean, it's the best monetization layer out there, because you have direct visibility also to the user's balance sheets, their ERC20s and their NFTs. I mean, it's just having social graph on top of there. It's just like a dream job for someone who is working in, let's say, data science, machine learning, trying to figure all these algorithms. And the value sharing layer is quite simple. So in its simplicity, you can pass any address to any of these transactions. So you could basically create content on one of the applications, let's say on Butterfly, for example, which is a mobile app, right? So user creates content, sets a fee to collect the content, and then there's let's say an algorithm that other applications are using to surface that content to all these other apps that have integrated Lens. And it surfaces to one of the users in Orb, as an example. So, and that user could mirror, so reposts the content to someone who is using, let's say, another Lens application, and where the end user is collecting it. So the end user is paying for that collect. And what happens here is that all that revenue can be shared across all these applications, even if there's co-creators, by simply submitting more data on who this transaction should be shared with. And I think this is like a groundbreaking, because I really haven't seen a social graph, or let's say like a social media, where all the kind of monetization is just shared across whoever has some sort of additional value input into that kind of like a content supply chain. And I think that's a very key thing about these shared social networks, as for example Lenses, where you can just share that monetization. So let's say you build a small application, but you have the best experience and you have more users, and you can surface content from all these other applications and share that monetization. So in some ways, it creates also monetization stream from one application to another, and creates a bit more healthier ecosystem. You can also build on Lens and just decide not to opt into these features, and simply just build on your own graph and not focus on kind of like building on a shared graph. It really depends what these engineers really are going after.
Got it. Touching on the modularity piece, I've realized, and I haven't seen this yet, but I mean, there's some really cool things you can do with like the follow function, which I didn't realize. An example of this is you're able to, like, now that you have these primitives as NFTs, you could program these NFTs, right? And so an example that you guys gave earlier was being able to have built-in governance capabilities, such as vote delegation. So, and a really cool example of this is let's say I could create a DAO based on the followers that have followed me for 5 years. My longest standing followers will get some sort of like, I could create some sort of like functionality around the follow function, which I thought was very cool. So I guess the question here is like, maybe like V1 social was like, you just follow people, V2 is like follow, then you have like this time feed, right? That you get to see what everyone else is doing in terms of actions. Is 3 like, or phase 3 partly more like programmable functions where you're able to add functions on top of follows? Because I've noticed that with both the profile, like even when you're following a profile, there's certain functionalities that you can enable. So you could pre-program who can follow you, who cannot follow you, as an example. You could pre-program who can like or not like a tweet. You could pre-program who can mirror the transaction or mirror the content, who cannot mirror the content. Is this all part of like a world that you're like, what kind of world are you looking to construct based on all of the things that you have here laid out?
It's quite actually interesting because you could set rules like if you have a specific NFT or a POAP, you could engage with the content. Because currently, like we're using social media, just like few rules, like everyone can comment or only people who you follow back. But you could actually add a lot of different rules. For example, that if someone followed you before a certain time, or their followers between 1 and 100, because kind of like all these follow relationship has that blockchain-based timestamp. So the follow ID as well. So maybe you want comments only of your followers that were early, and maybe that they should hold. Maybe you want to just ask a question, for example, that what do the AAVE token holders think about this particular question, and limit the answering only to those AAVE token holders, because it's all on chain, so you can verify the checks and then they can actually comment on that post. So the really like the world is really open on that perspective, like how much you can create programmability. I personally want to see more kind of like a simple but super powerful use cases, because in the beginning we were talking a lot about what you can actually do, and sky's the limit, and you can add programmability, and you can do this, and you can do 5 other things. Now I'm kind of looking more for what are some really simple use cases for these primitives that could actually like empower a lot of the user engagement and user actions. In theory, you can build anything, and I think that's where I kind of like want to see more things evolve towards.
Got it. So I'm going to, and I know you've published some facts earlier this year that talked about some of the usage. Lens has about 120,000 user profiles. Lens users have created 3.4 million NFTs, and the average user has collected about $50 in revenue from monetization. Is that still accurate? Has it changed since then? Curious.
Probably it has. The way we think about data quite a lot, so we don't really track too much of the amount of profile minting, because obviously to mint the profile, you need to get an invite from an existing user that has an invite. Or typical scenario is that someone sends us a DM on Twitter, or is building something on a hackathon, like an e-global hackathon, or they participate in RWAs, and we give them profiles. I believe they mean a profile. So it's still kind of like a beta onboarding process at this point. But what we are moving towards is that where the kind of access is more open, meaning that anyone can come in and create a profile and create their social media presence across these applications. We really want to actually have less decision on how these profiles are created and more push towards the actual applications to decide how they want to onboard their users. That's where we kind of are sitting at. So we want to make less decisions and ensure that they can decide how they create their audiences. Because at the end of the day, it goes back to the earlier discussion about Lens being a protocol, meaning that we really are not the ones who needs to decide about this in the future, but it's those applications that are creating their audiences and use cases.
So maybe final question on the Lens side. What are your thoughts on Friend.tech?
I think it's quite a similar model of the couple of previous ones I saw. Can't remember the names.
BitClout.
BitClout?
Yeah,
BitClout.
yeah, definitely. So I do think it's appealing for the audience that kind of like think about the trading aspect. And crypto is kind of like a full of, if you think about blockchain in some ways, it is a kind of like a money graph in some ways. So it's a social graph with access on visibility to different balance sheets and whatnot. So it definitely is a good kind of example that you can create applications that have, let's say, that's financial aspect and the social aspect. I've seen some like kind of like discussions whether like it's too over financialization, but I really think that it's more about just building out different use cases and seeing how they're going to work. And I think the more we build, whether it's like social fi or social applications, the more we kind of see that what people are excited about. So it might be like less appealing to someone who doesn't understand the nature of buying things on chain, but it's appealing to someone who is already, spending money and buying NFTs. And there are a lot of people. There are people who are collecting NFTs across the Lens network, and they also have keys on and buying keys on Friend.tech, and they're interested about it. But I appreciate mostly about the fact that there's a good like an on-chain component there that shows kind of like the power of what you can do with on-chain social. So for me, that's quite cool.
I mean, in theory, you can build Friend.tech on Lens v2, right? Lens v2 feels generic enough to build a Friend.tech kind of product.
You can, and I'm actually looking for some sort of open action towards that, so that could actually like somehow benefit both of them. I mean, the easiest thing is that you could build an open action where you can, buy and sell keys directly to your on your Lens feed. So if someone wants to build that, I'm happy to talk about it. So hit me up on the socials. But that's just an example. So I do think that the composability is important, and that's what's the benefit about Web3 and permissionless networks is that you can really build on top. So that's something that we're focusing on, how to make Lens more open. So anything you build in Web3, whether it's like social fi, DeFi, or really like a social application, how that could be actually used with Lens as well.
Stani, this is a good segue into DeFi. I just went to permissionless, and it seems like every conversation in DeFi is about RWAs, real world assets. What do you think about RWAs, and does AAVE want to do anything in that area? Curious what you think.
Yeah, I mean, we pioneered with RWAs in some extent. There was a AAVE market deployed by the Centrifuge team, RWA market.io, where you could use those RWAs as a collateral to borrow against liquidity against them. This was done roughly like I think a year and a half, almost 2 years ago. And obviously, like some of the biggest kind of like items are RWAs. So in DeFi, USDC, I mean, USDT, those are effectively RWAs as well, in my opinion. So kind of like off-chain assets. So I do think there's a lot of value there. And I do think that blockchain is a very good place to kind of like transparently interact with these assets and create programmability and create kind of like a global borderless liquidity networks as well for these assets. So I do think that's definitely the future. I think the simplicity is the key. The reason why stablecoins, like centralized stablecoins, have been able to grow and scale is that they've been very simple and they have a use case. So whatever that on-chain, off-chain asset will be, I think the use case is something that needs to be figured out.
So aside from stablecoins, what do you think is the most obvious asset class or asset to be tokenized next and get adopted in DeFi?
That's an interesting question. I mean, maybe tequila. That I haven't seen anyone tokenizing a good tequila or mezcal, but that could be seriously interesting. Like items that really have fungibility, but they have also kind of like some way to give value. I do think credit is definitely always a big thing. If you are able to tokenize off-chain credit, and also like in a way that you have different tranches, so you can take exposure on a senior tranche or junior, depending on your risk appetite. I think that's an interesting opportunity, and the world is full of credit, and I think that's a very big open market. And obviously, like people are doing treasury bills, seems like a low hanging fruit as well.
There's a lot happening on DeFi. An example is Curve launched their own stablecoin, AAVE launched its own stablecoin, and others are looking to launch their own stablecoins as well. So we're starting to see some bundling happening within DeFi where, maybe, one is a very strong AMM, the other is a very strong lending product, and now they're releasing stablecoins. Could you see some cannibalization of like parallel markets within DeFi where you're starting to see some like maybe mega, like maybe what I would say is like kind of like bundling of adjacent startup sectors where the prominent startups are becoming much more prominent, right? Based on distribution, brand, etc. So I'm curious on like how you're seeing that.
Yeah, I do see that there's definitely like a bit the kind of like a bigger DeFi protocols are taking a lot of market share, but I think it's also because they have a lot of things that are built the right way in terms of like what the users want from the protocol level. The governance is working somewhat well and are decentralized. So I do think that it's really hard to like when you look at the Aave protocol, for example, it's the thing that the community is looking always is the scale. So not necessarily solving all the edge cases that you could possibly think about, like what if we start doing peer-to-peer type of market where the borrowers get less borrow cost and the actual suppliers get higher yield. We see mainly that's the kind of like a main way to scale is to focus on the main thing and not solving necessarily all the edge cases, because that's where it becomes very difficult and maybe also like the experience isn't the best for the average user. So I think that these more bigger protocols, they definitely have solved how to get scale in terms of the user experience, the protocol economics, and also keeping these decentralized organizations lean and decentralized. I think that's very important as well.
Uniswap launched Uniswap Wallet and Uniswap X, which is a intent-based aggregation, right? And it seems like Uniswap is looking to own kind of the entire stack of the value chain within DeFi. What are your thoughts on that? And do you think Aave is thinking from that lens perspective? Because the thing about like DeFi in general is that it's not very consumer friendly. So it's compared to like social networks, right? Like Lens. So I guess the question is, what do you think about Uniswap's approach? One, two is how do we get DeFi to the masses, and how are you thinking about it from an Aave perspective?
I think DeFi is built like a lot of the DeFi has been built, right? But that's the back end DeFi. What I kind of want to see more innovation is, and I think where the future lies in, is the so-called front end DeFi. So building the experiences, let's say with account abstraction and abstracting away DeFi, but bringing it closer to the users and getting better at onboarding. Things we actually have done more on the Lens side. When we go towards more consumer, I think that's where DeFi should be built. And I said that this a couple of times ago, but I think now it's the best time to build DeFi because that front end DeFi experience doesn't exist, but it's a huge opportunity because that's going to be the consumer facing interface. And that's where you can create a lot of brand value as well. So I do think that that's going to be the main innovation area in DeFi for a while.
Got it. And maybe before we move on to the founder segment, is there a world where like AAVE and Lens, like AAVE can bootstrap its growth through Lens?
I do think everything that is on chain somehow can be connected, and there's could be valuable loops. But for now, they're definitely like separate projects, and they have separate missions. And I think it's good as well because the AAVE protocol solves one particular challenge: getting liquidity, unlocking liquidity, and then Lens is more about social networking primitives and how to use them to empower the developers and users. I do think there's a way you can build an open action for something that actually interacts with the AAVE protocol. But there's definitely overlap with the communities. There are people who are using AAVE and are also on Lens and vice versa. I do think that doing DeFi activity on your feed is a very cool idea.
Cool. Qiao, you want to take the founder segment?
Yeah, Stani, I'd love to ask you a few questions that I know every early stage founder is thinking about and would love to learn from your experience building AAVE and Lens. Well, number one, what would you say is your top 1 or 2 lessons you've learned building in DeFi and social?
Top 2, maybe the one is that obviously you need to build DeFi and social the same way as any product. So first thing to do is to try to secure product market fit. If you have done that, the second thing is how to grow, the pie market share and so forth. So there's those 2 things, and everything else is around it. So that should be a founder's like main focus point. And maybe the second thing is to talking to users. And I'm stressing this out quite a lot because I think that's something we don't do that often. We do listen to Twitter and the narratives all the time, and I think a lot of founders when I talk to them as well, they are saying like, well, a lot of people are talking about this on socials. That doesn't necessarily mean that's what the users want, or that has actually demand, a feature or something else. So talking to the users is important. So I think those 2 rules will get founders very far. And I also think that they're very simplistic and apply to even non-Web3 building as well. And they're hard to obey, obviously, but keeping in mind them is always helpful.
So I want to focus on the finding the product market fit and talking to users for AAVE specifically, because when you built AAVE was your first project. In contrast to Lens is your second project, and at that time you already have a big network and big brand and credibility. So it's much easier to get users to talk to and find product market fit. So I want to focus on AAVE because that's what's the most similar to most early stage founders in this space. So for AAVE, how did you find your first 100 users?
It's interesting. Now I need to think about it. DeFi itself had like a few thousand users when AAVE was launched, so it wasn't that big of a space. Maybe a bit more, but effectively, it's those early users were interested in the space in DeFi and were technical enough to understand how to use it, and obviously being able to get access to those users and talk to them was very helpful. So I do think that talking about what you're building and building it in public is really helpful, and you don't have to overdo that, because you don't want to be a founder who spends all the time on Twitter, or on events and whatnot. Your main focus is to be heads down and finding things to build and talking to users. So I think it's like a piece by piece, but I think the access, being able to talk to your users is the most important thing.
I think what you mentioned about when AAVE first launched, there may be a few thousand users. I think it's obviously the user base is a lot bigger today, but the users that matter today, you still know who they are, and you still can easily find them on Twitter. Yeah, and it's actually very founders always ask me about go to market or finding your first 100 users. It's surprisingly simple. Yeah. It's not easy, but it's simple. It's simple in the sense that you just go on Twitter and find the people and talk to them, get on a call, pitch them your product, and hopefully you convert percentage of them. And if they don't convert, well, you add them to your Discord, your Telegram, and then just build in public. Just share it with them. It's surprisingly simple. And I think this hasn't changed in years.
They can be also like your friends that are in crypto, or might be your investors or whatnot.
Right.
And you have to start from somewhere. And get the first 10 users, and then the 21, and just talking to them frequently. I think that's the way.
How big of a role do you think the AAVE token played in terms of growth?
Not really much, I would say. I personally think that the biggest growth for us that helped quite a lot was to try to be as kind of like open-minded as possible. Just an example is that when the other liquidity protocols, they weren't listing, let's say, communities like Chainlink or all these other ones, AAVE actually went to those user bases and acquired by listing their assets and whatnot. So being just kind of like an open and trying to go into markets that might be less saturated could be very helpful. And I think that helped us the most in the beginning.
And in terms of big pivots or ideas, were there any major pivots you've had at AAVE?
Yeah. I mean, we went from peer-to-peer kind of like a model with Deepland to a peer-to-contract model. And mainly because that during that time, DeFi was evolving and on-chain assets were getting more liquidity. So we chose peer-to-peer model because we wanted users to actually choose their risk. And it's less scalable. But as basically that risk element started to decrease because liquidity increased on-chain, we basically pivoted into a peer-to-protocol model, which is more simple to supply liquidity and unlock liquidity against your collateral assets. And pivoting is good. It's actually very healthy to be able to drop something, even if you build it up to 90%, or you've been talking about it for a year and you have something live. It's really healthy because things move along all the time. So you should be moving with the space as well.
So this particular pivot, what gave you the idea and how did you gain conviction on it?
I think in general, at that time, it was the time when Uniswap had more pooled model. You started to see more on-chain liquidity. So the kind of like all signs pointed towards that, you could actually do the pooled model. You have to restrict the amount of assets you might have, but it actually could be the way to go. And it's still like, there isn't always like full conviction. I mean, you have to play by the ear and intuition, like a lot of intuition, because end of the day, like even that time, probably the biggest lending protocol had, or let's say any protocol had like 50 million TVL. Like that's like nothing compared to today. So it's not a big data point, but you have to try things out and see how they work.
So every major pivot, every major successful pivot I've seen, or just our original idea I've seen, is based on intuition, really good intuition. So my question is, how much of this intuition came from explicitly talking to users versus, just being in the space for a very long time and observing things and just internalizing things? What is the breakdown?
I think a little bit of both. The cool thing about on-chain data is also we can see all the liquidity. So it's kind of like a balance between data and intuition. But in our case, we were certain internally that this is the path that we're going towards. There was a little bit of intuition, a little bit of data as usual. So it's a bit of a balance. So you don't have to slave yourselves for the data, what the data says, but it helps you to actually then bet against data and more towards intuition. So it really is a more of a balance thing out there. But I definitely recommend to use the on-chain data because it's verified and it's there and it's like accessible. So that's a valuable source to make better decisions.
Shifting gears a little bit here. A lot of our founders are now thinking about, and you're starting to see this in the space anyways, which is founders are using like a point system, right? I think a lot of protocols in Solana are starting to use a point system. We're seeing this on Ethereum as well, obviously with Friend.tech and many others. And so the question is, what are your thoughts on that? And like, should founders be thinking about creating some sort of like point metrics as a way to engage and acquire users from a speculative perspective? I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the point system and like, can we use speculation as a way to get your first 1,000 users to use a product?
I would say like user acquisition is, at least to me, I mean, this is just like my pure opinion, but for me, user acquisition is quite valueless. And for me, like what's valuable is retention, because you can acquire a lot of users, and be out of business 1 year after, or lose all the users. We've seen in social, even like with Be Real, you get a lot of users, or Threads get up to 100 million acquisition, then you go sub 20 and even lower. So I would say like user acquisition is quite valueless at this point. So if it helps you to create brand awareness, that's okay. But also you will attract people that care about points. I think you have to be more thoughtful on how you build a system like that, so that you acquire the people you want to have there. And I would rather also focus more on the retention, because that's what matters end of the day.
Got it. And I guess my final question is Lens thinking about some sort of like airdrop, speculative points, etc.?
I was going to ask the same thing.
The way we are thinking about even like governance and decentralization is that we're shipping now the V2 out, which basically makes the protocol a bit more flexible and to build new things. And then the next idea is to basically open up the protocol a bit more for general public access, which is very cool, because that then helps then to get people actually on the Lens that want to start using it already. So those are the things we're focusing mostly now. And then beyond that, I have to come again back to give an update what's going to be after that.
Great. Well, any other final comments or thoughts you want to add, Stani, before we wrap up?
No, I think it was great. Yeah, if anyone actually wants to try Lens, if you're building something, or you're a creator, or I don't know, heavy social media user, send me a DM on Twitter. Happy to get you onboarded and trying all the apps. Besides that, was nice to catch up again.
Yeah, it's been a couple years, so definitely wanted to get this on the books. But yeah, Stani, great chatting. I'm really excited about both the future of AAVE and Lens, and all the work that you've been doing over the past 5 years. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
A lot to unpack with Stani. Both Lens as an architecture that's completely on chain, and I think which is really cool, which is Lens V2. There's just a lot to unpack there. So Qiao, why don't you bring up 1 or 2 points that stood out to you the most, that you're most excited about with Lens?
So remember during the intro, I said I really wanted to see more composability between social protocols. Well, Lens V2 does exactly that via open actions, because the idea of open actions is to enable the developers of Lens to create generic actions, right? So previously on Lens, on V1, as a user, what you can do is, for example, like, repost, and mint a post as an NFT. So that minting, that collect, they call it collect. So that collect action is a very specific action that you can do on chain, right? It turns the post into an NFT, and then you own the NFT. Now on V2 with open actions, it's not just collect that you can do, but anything else that you can do on chain, including, let's say, swapping on Uniswap, or potentially even borrowing, lending on AAVE. Anything you can do on chain can be an action within Lens. So for example, when you see someone post about Ethereum, they're really bullish on Ethereum, the reader of that post can just click buy Ethereum within that post. Now, this is a super basic example, but you get the idea. Like, yep. Lens becomes more composable with the rest of DeFi or NFTs or whatever, with the rest of the on-chain activities. So that's the thing that stood out the most. And this will make on-chain social a lot more playable, in theory, than it is today. Yeah.
This is probably one of the features I'm most excited about with V2. And here's like a perfect example is like, to find alpha, you have to do many things, right? Like whether it's using Zapper and following influencers like NFT, influencers, and see what they like and what they curate, and finding opportunities to buy the same collection, whether it's sifting through Etherscan, right? And figuring out like where's the alpha hidden, using Nansen and figuring out where the alpha is, what the smart money is doing. I don't know, doing analytics, looking at the user data and figuring, where the alpha is. to some regard, like you could take on-chain behavior, social on-chain behavior, and convert that into alpha, embedded alpha, right? So an example is if I see someone minting on my feed an NFT, right? I can click the mint button within the Lens app and automatically mint an NFT because I know this person that curates it is actually a really well-known NFT influencer, right? So it kind of like collapses 4 or 5 different things into just like one meta app. And I think this is a pretty big unlock that people haven't realized yet, and why this app actually is very different than, let's say, a Farcaster from a social experience like Farcaster or even Friend.tech. It's it enables like seamless integrations, or similar to like what Stani said, which is like hooks for Uniswap, right? Uniswap v4 launched hooks, and is a way to integrate and design newer types of elements for the end users. And similarly, I could see this being the Uniswap v4 hooks like integration for Lens.
Right. The big concept behind V2 and open actions on Lens, I think, is like, you remember we talked about this earlier, but from our point of view, the biggest difference between Lens and Farcaster is that Farcaster is very top down. It's app driven.
Yep.
It's app
That's right.
driving protocol. Whereas Lens is very much bottom up. It's the opposite. It's the protocol that drives apps. And in fact, you said that when Lens V1 first launched, they didn't even have an app. They just launched the protocol, and they just hoped that third-party developers started building on it, and they did. So these are two very different approaches. I don't know which one is going to win. But both have pros and cons. Super interesting experiments being made in parallel. But with V2 on Lens and open actions, they basically bring this idea to the next level. So previously on Lens protocol, you do these specific actions, right, like collect. But now Stani's idea or vision is bring the level of abstraction even lower, make it even more generic, even more programmable. If you think about layer one blockchain, so like layer one blockchains is a good analogy. If you think about layer one blockchains, what do they provide? They provide a Turing-complete programming language that the developer can do anything with it. Layer ones are the most generic thing. They sit at the lowest layer of abstraction. And that's why they got so much traction and accrue so much value, because there's anything can happen on chain. Anything can be built on chain. And the same idea is behind Lens V2, in my opinion. So, I mean, I don't have a strong opinion as to whether or not it'll work, but that is the idea I'm observing.
The second thing that's most interesting to me is monetization of the value chain. I thought was another interesting element. And let's throw out some hypotheticals, right? All right, so let's say I use Lens and I find bald before it was rugged, okay? Or even better, Harry Potter. I found Harry Potter, Obama, Sonic, Inu, okay? And I say, hey, my feed, I think this is going to be a great token. You should buy it. I aped in.
Yeah.
And someone mirrors it, right? And so someone else sees it in someone else's feed. And then they use open actions and they buy that token, right? Mm-hmm. So hypothetically, you could say that through open actions, there's some sort of like, and then through open actions in Uniswap, maybe there's a fee collected, right? Because I enabled that post, that alpha. And the part of the feed then goes to the person that mirrored it, the algorithm that fed it, right? And then to me, because I shared the original insight.
Yeah.
Interesting.
I mean, this idea is not new, right? Like,
yeah.
But no one has executed it really well. So it makes a lot of sense. So it's all a matter of execution.
Wait, what do you mean it's not new? Where was this done before?
Glass was this. The idea behind Glass was exactly this. Like, people retweet the videos. Like if you're a creator, you create a video, right? And other people retweet you, and the entire chain of people that from the creator to the retweets, they earn a fraction of the fees generated by that video.
Yeah, I think Glass was similar in that angle, but this I feel like has less friction.
I mean, conceptually it's the same thing. So
conceptually,
no one has really made this.
No one has done this at scale. No one has done this at scale yet, and I think that is what could be very interesting, because I think people would then be more incentivized to. It's like,
by the way, there was an alpha. I don't know if we should talk about this, but there was an alpha on Friend.tech, and that's like apparently Friend.tech was going to do something about this with this as well. Like
they are
the referral program, right?
Oh yeah. So
So like basically, if you are a creator and you refer others to join Friend.tech, you earn a fraction of the fees that the users that you refer to generated later on. So it's the same idea of for everyone that's part of the value chain or for everyone that's part of the referral chain to capture a little bit of the revenue generated.
The difference, I would say, could be that, one could be in perpetuity, right? Friend.tech, I could see being perpetuity because I think it's just like an affiliate link, whereas with this, it's more like creator posts, right? Like, yeah. And then you get some sort of like cut out of the posts that were collected or whatever actions were enabled through open actions. But yeah, I think those two were like the pretty big highlights for me when it comes to Lens and how it's different than Farcaster and Friend.tech.
Same.
So let's throw out a fun question here. Of the three, I guess without like calling out winners and losers, because I don't like doing that, because anyone could win. In the world in this post-crypto world, which ones do you feel like could enable like onboarding of users at a 10x scale, right? Like if you were to look at a normie, right, like an average person, which app do you think would be easy for them to like get onboarded to?
Okay, but there's a difference between ease of onboarding and how compelling it is to get onboarded. There's so many apps in crypto that are so hard to onboard, but people do it anyway because the value proposition is so compelling. And that value proposition, by the way, is just money. Friend.tech is a good example. The onboarding is so bad, but the value proposition is great, which is to make a lot of money. So what are you asking exactly? Is it the ease of onboarding, or is it how compelling it is for normies?
I think both, right? I mean, if I'm a normie, which app would attract me the most, right? In terms of, similar like experiences to like Facebook or I don't know, Twitter. Like,
yeah.
Which app do you think could get mass distribution? I guess is the question. Like, which one will get the next wave of users? Is it Farcaster? Do you feel like Farcaster is it? Do you think Lens is it?
They're also different, but Farcaster is more similar. Well, no, not really. But if I'm a normie, there's so many problems with both Farcaster and Friend.tech. If I'm a normie, I just can't onboard to Friend.tech. Like the onboarding process is so painful. It's not possible to get onboarded.
Yep.
I need to connect my Apple ID. I need to link my Twitter and then buy some ETH, bridge it to Base, send it to this wallet. Oh my God. Like imagine that whole process.
They have a credit card integration now. So I don't know if that enables something.
They do?
They do.
Like, okay.
You can buy directly
that
through
would
credit
help
card
a little bit. But as things currently stand, the UX of Friend.tech is horrible. It's really bad. Farcaster actually has the best UX, both in terms of onboarding and once you've onboarded. But from a normie's point of view, would you use Farcaster today? The question is no. The answer is no, because there's no compelling reason for normies to use it.
Yep.
The discussions and the creators on Farcaster are all crypto natives. It's very compelling for crypto natives to get onboarded to Farcaster, but not for normies. Lens, I don't know where it's going. I have no idea. Because again, like the biggest difference between Lens and the other two is Lens is not application first; it's protocol first.
Yeah.
Like Friend.tech and Farcaster, you can clearly conceptualize how they work as a user. You know exactly what it is. The user experience is so clear; it is what it is. Lens, it'll boil down to what kind of applications will be developed by the builders, right? And we don't know where that's going yet.
To me, I'll like clearly put it in this, like I'll encapsulate it this way, which is Friend.tech has one shot, right, with its app, right? So they're focusing, you have an entire team that's focused on building this app. And they're heavily betting on speculation and all the other things that they're building into it. Farcaster is heavily building on app first, right? Build a winning app, get the best people, and then allow clients to flourish. And I think the way they're going to allow other clients to flourish is through channels. So I see them as, I see them unbundling, let's say, Reddit. So more like Web3 attacking Web2, right? For Lens, I see it as a completely new behavior, right? If it works, which is like completely embedding with DeFi and all the other primitives that are available. So it could be very likely that we'll see a new experience that we've never seen before. And we'll be using Lens without even knowing that we're using Lens as an example. And so it could very well be a very different distribution style compared to, let's say, app specific with Farcaster and then Friend.tech.
Yeah, absolutely agree. I mean, and also the three are actually fundamentally really different from each other. I don't think it's fair to put them in the same conversation. Actually, Friend.tech
100%.
Friend.tech is actually a meme coin trading platform. It is what it is. It's not really social. Who cares about it? The content in the group are total dog shit. I mean, I'm not paying. No one will pay 10 ETH for that dog shit. I'm not paying 10 ETH for the dog shit. It's a meme coin trading platform. It is what it is. Farcaster is a pure social platform. Lens can be both.
So maybe we'll pause here and we will talk about Friend.tech at a deeper scale on our next episode, and then really compare all the three and see where it all goes. Any final comments or thoughts?
No, I'm just having a lot of fun on these platforms. I mean, these three are basically the only apps I use currently.
Just some data. I spent... yeah, we'll leave it for next episode. All right. Thanks, guys, for tuning in. We'll see you guys next time. Hit subscribe if you haven't already. Thanks for listening to Good Game. Don't forget to subscribe. We'll see you next week.